All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice International Conference titled Truth Commissions, Issues of Access and Ownership. My name is Jennifer Wallace, and I am an RA with the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice, and I am your host for this conference. So you will see me pop up periodically on your screen to guide you through these next 2 days of important discussions about Truth Commission archives, documents, and narratives. I'm joining you all today from the land of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, colonially known as McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And if you feel comfortable, do share where you're joining us from today in the chat as I provide this short overview of what you can expect this morning, or perhaps for you, it is the afternoon or evening. We are thrilled to have today's keynote address titled Violation of a Truth Commission delivered by Verne Harris, and this keynote kicks off our conference. But before we formally get started with welcome remarks from Dr. Bonnie Avawa and Dr. Pamela Sweat, I am going to briefly go over the features available to you during the conference and the ways you can participate in today's event. This information will also be posted momentarily in the chat for reference. So you may access closed captions by clicking the icon on your Zoom menu panel titled Closed Caption or Live Transcript, and then toggle between Show Subtitle to turn on closed captioning and Hide Subtitle to turn them off. There will be time for a Q&A session at the end of Mr. Harris's talk, so please do feel free to use the chat feature to pose your questions during this talk. And if you would prefer to ask your questions verbally, we just ask that you let us know in the chat and we will unmute you when it is your turn to ask a question. As we have many wonderful attendees today, we just ask that during the presentation, you turn off your video to ensure maximum bandwidth for everyone here today. But of course, during the Q&A period, please feel free to turn that video back on. And just a quick reminder, this event is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice YouTube page. And with that, I will pass things over to Bonnie Avawa to formally introduce today's event.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Can you hear me? My audio working good? Great, thank you so much, Jenny. My name is Bonnie Bao. I am a professor of international human rights here at McMaster University and one of the organizers of this international conference. On behalf of the director of the McMaster Center of Human Rights and Restorative Justice, Dr. Juanita de Barros, who's unavoidably absent today, I welcome you to this international conference on Truth Commission's issues of access and ownership. We are delighted to have you join us virtually for this conference, which is one of the main academic events organized by the center this year. We have over 100 participants from around the world registered for this two-day conference, which I think speaks to the significance and interest in this topic. The Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice at McMaster University is dedicated to the multidisciplinary and transnational study of human rights and restorative justice processes worldwide. Our work at the center aims to address historical atrocities and contemporary human rights violations, as well as explore the ways in which societies seek to rebuild and repair in the aftermath of conflict and abuse. Our center brings together a network of expert scholars, policymakers, human rights and peace-building practitioners, community leaders, and other stakeholders to study the impacts and legacies of human rights violations alongside the restorative justice mechanisms established to address these violations. The papers on Truth Commission processes and documentation that will be presented at this two-day conference exemplify the kind of in-depth research on restorative justice issues that our center seeks to support and cultivate. Our goal is to provide a platform, a knowledge platform, for the sustained study of global human rights conditions and transitional justice projects, including providing the research infrastructure necessary for archiving data and resources that enable the exploration and analysis of collective memories of human rights violations and post-conflict peace building. We also aim to engage in sustained knowledge communication and outreach to key stakeholders through activities that include policy consultancy, education and media literacy, and community engagement. The McMaster Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice takes a broad approach to human rights and restorative justice. We approach human rights not simply as legalistic or political entitlements, but also as ethical claims founded on cross-cultural notions of human dignity and well-being. Our approach to transitional and restorative justice emphasizes responsibility, redress through restitution and guarantee of non-recurrence, peace building, and societal repair. The work of our center is founded on the belief that collective acknowledgement of past atrocities, redress of present abuses, reflection, and repair through restorative justice processes can help build more equitable and inclusive societies. This, in turn, can foster civic engagement and democratic participation. And this is why I personally think that the papers that will be presented at this conference are very important to this question and why we are very pleased to host this conference. Let me end by thanking the institutions and organizations that have partnered with us to organize this conference. It's been several months in the making. The Confronting Atrocity Project at the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice, McMaster University, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba, the Social Science Research Council's Africa Peace Building Network Program in the United States, the Nelson Mandela Foundation in South Africa, and Sorbonne University, Abu Dhabi. I look forward to the presentations and deliberations that will follow. I will now hand over to the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University, Dr. Pamela Sweat, who has been an unflinching supporter of our initiatives at the center, who will bring opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you find yourself today. My name is Pamela Sweat, as Bonnie just mentioned. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Humanities here at McMaster. Welcome to our virtual conference. As a settler on these lands, I would like to begin by acknowledging that McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee Nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. To speak these words is to acknowledge a deep debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our individual responsibility as settlers to undertake the challenging and ongoing journey of reconciliation. Of course, it is reconciliation's counterpart, truth, which you are here to explore. Specifically, what happens once a society's truth about unthinkable atrocities has been spoken? How is that truth documented, preserved, and crucially made available to future generations? I'm an historian as well as Dr. Abawa, and I specialize in the social and cultural history of Germany leading up to and during the Second World War. And so, of course, this question of the preservation of truth, especially following egregious human rights violations, is particularly resonant to me. Truth commissions are, by their nature, temporary, but the truth is not temporary, and neither should be the documentation of that truth. That's why conferences like the one that you're participating in today are so important. By exploring and identifying the ongoing challenges with preserving documentation following the conclusion of truth commissions, you are helping to ensure that the transformational power of the truth doesn't get lost to bureaucracy, disorganization, or suppression. And now let me introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Verne Harris. Verne Harris heads the Nelson Mandela Foundation's leadership and knowledge development processes. He was Mandela's archivist from 2004 to 2013, directed the Foundation's archives program for 15 years, and directed the dialogue and advocacy program for 5 years. He is an adjunct professor at the Nelson Mandela University and participated in a range of structures which transformed South Africa's apartheid archival landscape, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He is also a former Deputy Director of the South African National Archives. He has authored or co-authored 6 books, the most recent one being Ghosts of Archive in 2021. In 2014, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Cordoba in Argentina. From 2018 to 19, he held the Follet Chair at Dominican University in Chicago and has received archival publication awards from Australia, Canada, and South Africa. Please join me in welcoming Verne Harris.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sweat, and greetings, everybody. It's a real honor to be with you today, and I'm grateful to everyone on the organizing committee, McMaster University. Special thanks to Proscovia, and of course to everyone who's attending today. Let me say at once that I was in 2 minds as to whether I should accept the invitation to speak. And still, in this moment, remain ambivalent. On the one hand, I have said so much about truth commissions over the years. Is there anything fresh I can say? I was asking myself. On the other hand, the invitation gave me the opportunity to look back at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, from the vantage point of 2022 and see it now as one of the very first of what have been a plethora of commissions of inquiry in the democratic era here in South Africa. And I wanted to close my input today by reflecting on the commission in this democratic era. And then, of course, there was a certain reluctance on my part to revisit the pain of promises broken, hopes dashed, and betrayal after betrayal. So I do want to focus on the South African TRC using those twin lenses provided by the conference theme, namely ownership and access. Working, of course, within the broader frame of the archive. The more I've thought about it, the more these 2 lenses, ownership and access, feel like dimensions of a single lens. For ownership determines who has access, how, and when. And those who secure access arguably are in possession in ways as significant as the legal determinations of property. Most importantly, the ones who have access determine how content will be represented. They own, if you like, the narrative. As for my narrative today, I am revisiting the ways in which the work of the South African TRC was violated by powerful interests. But I also want to suggest the active violation that is always involved, structurally, systemically, when any truth commission is constituted. So my title, Violation of a Truth Commission, uses both the genitive case and the indefinite article in 2 different senses. South Africa's TRC. In both public discourses and the language of the Commission itself, the work of the TRC, including its records, archives, and other information resources, were the people's resource, held in trust. And though technically and legally, the Commission was a structure of the state, effectively it was managed by elements of civil society within a civil society ethos, and its records were public records. As it closed down, and it took a period for this to happen between 1998 and ultimately 2003, this scenario transitioned, and TRC assets became the people's resource held by the state and administered by the public service. So in terms of the Commission's enabling legislation, when the Commission closed down, all its assets devolved to the Department of Justice. And there was a good legal argument for this. The department had been the parent government department for the Commission, its primary enabling department. And the Department of Justice, in the planning, would also become the primary implementer or overseer of the implementation of the Commission's recommendations. Now, as the TRC offices started to be closed down, there was a discussion between the Department of Justice, the Commission itself, and the National Archives. And the National Archives was making the argument that the archive should move straight into the custody of the National Archives for three reasons: the professional expertise. Secondly, the National Archives had worked with the Commission from the outset on its record-keeping systems. And then thirdly, the National Archives at that time had a potentially critical asset, namely the National Archives Commission, which was a civil society watchdog with certain executive powers. So that commission was a statutory body appointed through a process of public nomination. In the end, agreement was reached where, in principle, all the records of the Truth Commission would go straight to the National Archives, except for the electronic records, the databases and everything, the content that was downloaded from hard drives and servers. Now, in my view, this was a bad decision. Obviously, the Department of Justice needed access, especially to the electronic records, the databases, and so on. But an archival set could have been lodged with the National Archives immediately. It wasn't. And as I speak now, it's not clear what the status of that electronic record is. There was an audit done in the early 2000s. And even then, a significant proportion of the content was found to be unreadable. So it's not clear where we stand today. I've heard recently that the National Archives is in conversation with the Department of Justice, has set up a digital archive platform capable of absorbing that electronic record, but I'm not sure precisely what the status is. Between 1998 and 2000, in addition to then taking formal transfer of the TRC archive, with the exception of the electronic records, the National Archives began scoping, auditing, tracing, and securing what I call TRC alienated records and TRC associated records. And I won't give you a long inventory, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. The public broadcaster had a massive archive having covered the TRC process. A set of that record was transferred to the National Archives. The security establishment records, which had survived the systematic destruction in the early 1990s, National Archives was following up on those records accumulations, making sure that they were still secure and trying as far as possible to secure transfer to the National Archives. Many of the Commission records remained in private custody, so individual commissioners, individual staff members had kept records, and we began to audit this. I'll come back to this in a moment and give you one notable example. And then, of course, arguably the most significant, the community documentation, including oral histories. And there were civil society structures in place, and notably an extraordinary non-governmental organization, Kulamani, which began documenting the stories of those who had not gone to the commission, but also the stories of those who did go to the commission and hadn't been able to tell everything that they had wanted to. So that work was underway, well underway in 2000, until what I call the big shutdown. And I'll say more about this in relation to the question of access in a moment. Nelson Mandela had accepted the TRC report, the initial report in 1998, despite opposition to it from within his own party, particularly from his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. And then, of course, after one term as president, Mandela stepped down in 1999. And by 2000, the message was made clear to the National Archives and other involved officers of the state. From the highest level, shut down all plans to open the TRC archive. Shut down all plans to foreground and mobilize it. Now, I was in the National Archives at the time, and from that moment on, the institution was paralyzed. The National Archives Commission, which I referred to a moment ago, very quickly was turned into a sweetheart advisory body with absolutely no watchdog functions left. Staff became paranoid, beholden to bureaucrats and intelligence officers. And the continuing archival work had to be taken up by civil society. I've referenced Kulamani. They did amazing work in that period and beyond. But I want to just to give those of you in this space today just a sense of what I'm talking about from our own experience. Just two examples. I left the National Archives in 2001 and joined a non-governmental organization called the South African History Archive. And very quickly, we took up this archival work related to the TRC. And one of the first priorities was a collection of 34 boxes of files which had been removed from the commission as the offices were being closed down and were under the control of National Intelligence Agency. I'd taken up this matter while I was at the National Archives. I was told to keep quiet. In fact, I was under investigation for misconduct for talking about it publicly. The South African History Archive took this up, litigated. Ultimately, it took years, it cost a lot of money before those 34 boxes were moved into the custody of the National Archives. And by my estimation, about 60% of the content was made publicly available. But that had to be fought for every inch. One other example, one of the commissioners came to the South African History Archive probably 2002 and invited us to come and look at her own. This is Yasmin Suka, who was the commissioner who stayed on the longest as the amnesty process was wrapped up. She had a significant, enormously valuable collection in her own custody, and she did not feel comfortable. She did not trust the state system as it had developed by that point to simply hand over those records. And what we did as the South African History Archive was to take those records into custody, copy them, and then to engage in conversations with the National Archives. And the originals were ultimately then transferred to the National Archives in a set was kept in the custody of the South African History Archive. I'm talking about custody, I'm talking about ownership, I'm talking about securing, but almost seamlessly I've started talking about access. Ownership is about access ultimately, and access is about ownership. The Commission's plan, its intention, was that its archive should become the most public archive of all, the most accessible, a truly people's archive. It recommended that community centers of memory be established around the country so that the Commission's own archive could be made accessible to those communities more effectively, but also that the continuing work of documenting and expanding the stories which had emerged would be driven by these centers of memory. The hearings, the Truth Commission hearings, which had been in camera, the so-called Section 29 hearings, I think it was in the very last meeting of the Commission, the decision was taken to open them to the public, to open the record of those hearings. Discussions were underway to digitize all the paper-based and related records and to ultimately make that archive accessible online. 1999, 2000, talks were already underway with Michigan State University and University of Michigan as well to support the digitization of the archive. And critically, the Commission wanted its archive to be a resource to the work involved in implementing all of its recommendations. And these recommendations were wide-ranging: reparations, restitution, prosecutions, repatriation of records to neighboring countries. I could go on listing these recommendations. So the Commission wanted its archive to be a dynamic resource in support of all those processes. And by early 1999, government departments had been given those recommendations, and each department had to identify recommendations which it could become involved in either implementing itself or supporting the implementation thereof. But then came the big shutdown. And I want to share an anecdote with you, how this felt within a structure of the state. So in the National Archives, on a particular day in the year 2000, I walk into my office and there's a stranger going through files on my desk. And it turns out to be a National Intelligence Agency operative who's been assigned to the Department of Arts and Culture and is doing spot checks. And I'm told that I'm in breach of information security standards because all classified records have to be locked up at all times. And that for me was the first indication that something dramatic was happening. National intelligence operatives were assigned to government departments. The National Archives appointed security officers. New security requirements were put in place. So new security systems were put in at the National Archives. Any archivist working with the Truth Commission archive had to get security clearances. The strong rooms that we had identified for the Truth Commission archive, right adjacent to the public reading room, in order to demonstrate its accessibility, that had all been changed. The strong rooms furthest removed from the public interface spaces were then identified. all digitization planning was frozen. And all processing was frozen. So the National Archives had done an initial listing, drawing up of a very rough inventory of content. But the arrangement and description, the detailed arrangement description, that process was frozen. And very quickly, it became extremely difficult to access the Truth Commission archive for researchers, for people within the National Archives, except those who had security clearances, and even, and this is the most heartbreaking, is victims of human rights violations and families of those victims. And I've spoken about this, I've written about this, just to mention one instance, which is kind of emblematic, the Dulcie September case. This is the ANC representative in Paris who was assassinated in 1988. There was a special investigation by the Truth Commission. The files for that investigation were in those 34 boxes that I mentioned earlier. They were secured by the National Archives, but the family was not given access. The South African History Archive tried to force access for the family. To this day, they haven't had access to those investigation files. As I'm speaking now, the Nelson Mandela Foundation is supporting the family in an attempt to have the investigation into her assassination reopened in France. But still, that archive is effectively locked up. The terrible irony of this democratic era in terms of public access to archive is that the very instruments which were designed to enable what we then called in the 1990s freedom of information, open democracy, and I'm talking about the Promotion of Access to Information Act and the Protection of Personal Information Act, have become the locks that prevent effective access, together with a piece of legislation dating back to 1982, the Protection of Information Act, which is effectively an Official Secrets Act, which still remains on the statute book today. What I've been describing, I think, is the violation of a Truth Commission and its work, the betrayal of people, the capture of a people's archive. French thinker Jacques Derrida warned us of this in 1998. We should have seen it coming. In that year, in the midst of the TRC processes in South Africa, Derrida offended many South Africans by suggesting that the TRC was most fundamentally an exercise in forgetting. For Derrida, the TRC was inaugurated with an originary forgetting, a forgetting of genesis, of lineage, of structural imbrication. As he said at a seminar he gave at the University of the Witwatersrand, perhaps this is the unconfessed desire of the Truth Commission, that as soon as possible, a future generation may have simply forgotten it. Let us forget it to go on to survive. That's what we are doing, just archive against memory. This is one way of making sense of what unfolded as TRC records were archived. Legal scholar Adam Sitzer offers another in his important book, The Impossible Machine, published in 2013. And here I am leaning heavily on a particular chapter in my recent book, Ghosts of Archive. So apologies to those of you who have read this book, you will know the argument. Sitzer argues that TRC mythology and the discourses influenced by it neglect, if not occlude, the longer historical contexts out of which the TRC emerged. And he suggests that understanding them is fundamental to understanding the TRC's impact or lack of impact. Like so many other truth commissions, South Africa has emerged out of a long experience of colonialism. It is no accident, Sitzer points out, that the majority of these commissions have been held in countries that were under European colonization. In these countries, there are colonial traditions fundamental to how truth commissions are shaped. Sitzer focuses on two in particular. Firstly, the Colonial Commission of Inquiry, in terms of which the state goes out into the far reaches of a polity, listening closely to the voices of the disaffected and the aggrieved, recording their stories, whatever their station, archiving them and analyzing them. In order not to understand need and implement measures to meet that need, but rather to determine risk and to understand the nature of the challenge to the state's authority, so that adjustment can be effected, so that fundamental structural change can be averted. Secondly, the well-established colonial tradition of indemnity for officials guilty of crimes, without requirement for disclosure, without accountability, most often without process beyond a rubber stamp. Of course, South Africa's TRC required of perpetrators full disclosure and a demonstration of both political motive or mandate and proportionality. The act was proportional to the political objective before amnesty could be given. However, as we know, very few perpetrators of human rights violations used the TRC's mechanism. And given the post-apartheid state's reluctance to prosecute those failing to secure amnesty, an effective blanket amnesty, not far removed from colonial indemnity, has been implemented. Sitzer's conclusion is troubling for transitional justice discourse. Just a brief quote from Sitzer. The TRC's unprecedented character, as well as the significance of its concrete function as a transitional mechanism, and the measure of its success or failure, are most illuminatingly named once we understand its operation with reference to its reiteration of its precedents in colonial and imperial jurisprudence, unquote. And Sitzer might have said, in apartheid jurisprudence. For the apartheid state almost perfected the arts of indemnity and commissions of inquiry. So for Sitzer, the TRC was not unique, nor special, nor unprecedented. In a fundamental sense, it was more of the same. And therefore, its impact has been far from surprising. Beyond the intentions or the wishes of its founders and functionaries, it had inherited a poisoned chalice. Within this frame, the Derrida-Sitzer frame, the TRC was always already structurally a violation. Not unconnected to this kind of analysis is that of someone like Brent Harris, who argued in 2002 that the TRC was created around a particular meta-narrative and that its apparatuses of archive formation very deliberately did the research, gathered the evidence, foregrounded the voices, and covered the terrain which would reinforce that meta-narrative. He had a point. There was an almost overwhelming meta-narrative at play, rooted in Christian notions of confession, repentance, and redemption, promoted insistently by the TRC's chair, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and deputy chair, and connected to notions of South Africa as a rainbow nation. And then a web of sub-narratives held the conceptual frame and the process together. For instance, and I'll just mention this one, the principle of equivalence, which suggests that a human rights violation is a human rights violation, no matter who perpetrates it and in what context. That was the critical underpinning of the legislative instrument which created the TRC. This meant that acts committed by agents of the state in the context of systemic state terror were to be assessed in exactly the same way as acts committed by freedom fighters in the context of a just war, of a liberation struggle. This principle incensed many powerful people within the ANC, and in my assessment became the root of the post-Mandela government's hostility towards anything related to the TRC. But for me, Harris's analysis didn't quite account, this is Brent Harris's, didn't quite account for the messiness of the TRC process, nor the extent to which numerous commissioners, staff, and consultants rejected the meta-narrative and actively sought to subvert it. Nor did it give me a convincing explanation of the longer historical contexts out of which the TRC emerged. For this, I had to wait for the work of Sitter, and many others subsequent to that 2013 work have been making similar arguments. I'm drawing towards a close now. There were other violations, layers of violation, should I say, which I saw from within the processes of the TRC. And I don't want to enumerate all of them. There isn't really time to do that. So just a few. Despite the TRC's commitment to transparency and public participation, there were mysteries, even secrets, in relation to its apparatus. So, for instance, dissatisfaction was heard from many communities at the lack of consultation around public hearings. Questions were raised around who was selected to give oral testimony and why. I've mentioned the hearings that were in camera, and to this day, none of those hearings are in the public domain. Many researchers at the time, while the commission was still working, spoke of their frustration at being denied access to TRC records. Information on certain TRC decision-making processes, internal tensions and disputes, was carefully kept out of the public domain. So always with archive, there is apparatus, and there's the exercise of an archontic power. The TRC itself was always already structurally a violation. And the commissions of inquiry in South Africa's democratic era have been more of the same. At the outset, I used the phrase plethora of commissions. Most recently, we've seen the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into Corruption related to what is called state capture. After years of controversy about the 1990s arms deal, the Seriti Commission was appointed to investigate. The failures of our land reform program were referred to a panel of experts under former President Motlanthe. When striking miners at Marikana were massacred in 2013, a commission of inquiry was appointed. Former Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke headed a commission tasked with investigating the deaths of people with special needs, supposedly in the care of the state. When a wave of public violence rocked South Africa in 2021, a panel of experts was appointed to investigate the causes. I could go on and on and on. What these commissions and other instruments of inquiry all have in common is the extent to which their findings and recommendations are filed away rather than acted on. whatever the intentions of those working in them, no matter the quality of the work they do, they are designed to create a simulacrum of accountability, of justice. They appease publics, distract, delay, enable the state at best to make minor adjustments. The TRC, and for me it's hard to say this, in retrospect, was a perfect template for the commissions to follow. The latter have been worthy descendants of the TRC and of both colonial and apartheid jurisprudence. In fact, it could be argued that, to use Sitzer's phrase, these commissions are most illuminatingly named within referencing of the colonial. Right now in South Africa, we are worried about the archive of the Zondo Commission, which concluded its work this year. We talk about ownership of it and access to it. But the question of archive is imbricated within broader societal questions of ownership and access. And there, tragically, we find resilient imprints of colonial relations of power. There are long lineages informing and determining who has access to property, to opportunity, to services, and who owns capital in all its forms, from the material to the social. The work of decolonization still remains before us, and the work of archive is still the work of justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Verne, for that. A lot for us to think on here. We now have about half an hour for some questions. So if you have any questions, please do submit them in the chat, or if you would like to ask it verbally, just let us know in the chat as well, and we will make sure you're unmuted to do so.
Can I start? Thank you, Mr. Harris, for a very stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. Mine is a very simple question, and it goes to the point you've made. Who is afraid of the archives? Who is afraid of the TR archives? From your experience and from what you've narrated, if you could bring it down to maybe one or two key points, what is the fear? What is the anxiety about making TRC archives accessible, particularly in the South African context? Thank you.
Do you want me, Jennifer, I'm just wondering, do you want me to respond to individual questions or to wait for a few to come in? And please, not only questions, I'm hoping someone's going to disagree with me and we can get into a bit of a debate.
Yes, so I have a list of names coming up in the chat here that people have questions. So when someone asks a question, feel free to respond directly to that, and then we'll move through the list here. So Stephen Davis has a question here.
Hi, Verne. Thank you for your talk. It's very thought-provoking and answered a lot of questions that I've had for quite some time. This may be too close to Bonnie's question to warrant a second answer, but I am the principal investigator of a research group called the Bitteralla Project, and we use machine learning models to extract data from TRC testimonies. And one of the projects that we worked on was with the Section 29 records. And the thing that I was struck by was just how uncontroversial much of the content was within those records. And it kind of begged the question, what is the big fear among officials? Is there reluctance to release these records out of malice or hostility to the TRC process itself? Is it out of neglect, not assigning enough resources or not wanting to assign resources? Or is it ignorance? Is it a worry about the unknown unknowns that may lie within the archive that may complicate their jobs and make their lives a little bit more difficult? So that's my question. Thank you.
So maybe I should come in on these two points, and thank you for that. For me, I think it's a combination of ignorance over and over again. In my own experience, I've seen how records which we are told are full of explosive information, highly sensitive, potentially damaging. When you look at the content, you find, no, that's not true. I mean, the 34 boxes, for example, the content was overwhelmingly bland. That's why 65% of the content could be put in the public domain almost immediately. But I think it's a combination of that kind of ignorance. And you know, within structures of the state, to know what's in the archive, you have to actually do that detailed processing. You actually have to read the content. But when you're told not to touch, well, you find people who actually don't know what's inside the files. Combination of that ignorance and the fear of what might be revealed. What are people actually hiding? And I'm not suggesting that there should be no restrictions on access to the content of the TRC archive, the South Africa's commission, but this would apply to other commissions. I myself saw records with content potentially harmful to people, for example, whose own family members had collaborated with the state, had given information about them. That kind of information has to be handled very carefully and in consultation with the individuals concerned, of course. But I think what powerful, not only individuals, but formations were afraid of when the big lockdown took place was the possibility of evidence being put in the public domain of the seduction that took place starting in the 1980s and continuing through the 1990s, the seduction of elements within the liberation movements by capital. Compromises were made, money was paid, relationships were formed, and in my view, fear of the details of deals, of agreements behind the scenes, that is the underlying fear. And well, I experienced it as a paranoia. I'll stop there, Jennifer.
Great, thank you. Up next, we have Praskovia Spard, who will ask a question.
Thank you. There's a lot of echo. Is it have a technical glitch? Is it okay now? Okay, thank you, colleague Van Harris, for your very insightful keynote speech. I have interviewed you during my research in South Africa, and we've shared. I do indeed feel like you do, that one gets tired of talking about truth commissions. Now, I do have colleague Michelle Caswell, who argued that without using the TRC archives, they can never bear any meaning to the victims. The South African Truth Commission has been sold internationally as a template, and it has been used in the case of Sierra Leone and Liberia, but also I think the TRC in Kenya visited to draw lessons from South Africa. So I'm just wondering, what exactly is the problem, since the same template continues, despite its shortcomings, to be sold to new countries? We've just seen the Gambian case. And when I was in Adelaide lastly in 2019, before COVID struck, they were equally wondering, the National Archives were wondering when they were going to get involved. So do we see, I personally suspect that when it comes to post-conflict reconstruction, the notion of the archive doesn't ring a bell to those people who make decisions, strategic decisions. Indeed, information management is never on the agenda. And usually when, well, in the South African case, I guess it was different with all the international support it drew, and sharing with you, of course, revealed that you had a well-developed record-keeping system. But we see shortcomings in other countries where there is no information management infrastructure or a plan to take care of the archives. And this has as well, coupled with the lack of the political will, hampered access to the TRC archives. So I would like you to sort of further elaborate on that. You know, the fact that when it comes to post-conflict reconstruction, information management, the archives are not prioritized as something important that has to contribute to the reconciliation or building up of these post-conflict societies. Thank you.
No, thank you, Proscovia. You know, representatives from the Gambia are going to be in South Africa shortly. The same with the Central African Republic. So I hear what you're saying, and I don't have a ready answer for you. I think the challenge for all of us, wherever we are, is to be making that just society that ensures that the people's archive becomes the people's resource. Where we have failed in South Africa is not in terms of the model that was used for the Truth Commission, the model that was used for many other special instruments for restitution and reparation, the land restitution process, for example, special pensions for those who contributed to the struggles against apartheid. It's not that we used the wrong models, is that we fundamentally failed to redistribute wealth, restructure our society, transform our society fundamentally. And until we do that, the kinds of challenges that I was talking about, the kinds of challenges that we are now talking about, will continue. And I'll be meeting with representatives from the Gambia in a week's time. And that's what I will be conveying to them. It's that deep work of societal transformation that determines what the People's Archive looks like. I'll stop there, Jennifer. I know there are other questions coming in, and I'm struggling to read the comments box.
Yeah, I have some here. Marjorie Jobson would like to actually unmute and ask. So go ahead, Marjorie.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you very much, Verne. I direct Khulumani Support Group with our 130,000 members who are direct victims and family members of victims of atrocities. And I think, Verne, your explanations have been incredibly helpful. We have, in the last 3 years, had major assaults on Khulumani, and our understanding of it is because we have this archive, which we store of the records of all these people, and it is, and we have actually been told that the process underway presently is to write a revisionist history, which attributes the largest share of bringing down the apartheid government to people who were in the liberation armies. And so we've had our office occupied. We very quickly learned from consulting a lawyer that they were probably after our archive. That's been confirmed to us by people who worked on the TRC. So it's been an incredibly difficult time, but we believe that archive is probably even more valuable than the TRC archive, because these are the voices of people the TRC failed to reach because they were largely in homelands and other areas. So we are very determined that this is not going to be sanitized off the records. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. We have a question from Stephen Esquith in the chat, so I'll just read that out here. It says, scholars who are not historians have challenged the objectivity of archival knowledge and the unavoidability of interpretation. In other words, the performative nature of testimonies, dispositions, and judgments about them. What is your view about the relationship between archival records and repertorial interpretations of them in art, theater, music, and literature? And what role do these performances have in understanding the meaning of the archive for political dialogue and transformation?
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's a deep theoretical line of inquiry. For me, just to reiterate what I was suggesting in what I was saying earlier and in written work, is that archive never speaks for itself. It's always mediated. And the forms, the instruments, the performative apparatus that you're referencing, these are the means by which the archive speaks to society. It's fundamental. Understanding that, I think, is fundamental to engaging archive in a way that is liberatory. And failure to recognize this undermines the power of archive significantly. Last point I would make is that in that space, what is absolutely critical is space for contestation. Is the performance of archive, the mediation of archive needs to be opened to contestation. The moment one closes that space, attempts to control the space, the potentially liberatory energy within archive is flawed, is undermined. I'll stop there, Jennifer.
Excellent. Stephen, I hope that addressed the question for you there. Claire Ann Louise has asked to verbally ask a question. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. I'm just checking you can hear and see me. Right, so thanks very much for that presentation, and it's actually very close to my own work on commissions of inquiry investigating violence in the mining sector, looking at the Marikana Commission and TRC. But I want to just comment on this idea of truth commissions as a violation in itself, and as Zaitse argues that it's because of this, its colonial character, right? Like the fact that these were part and parcel of colonial administration and justification of and legitimation of colonial violence. But doesn't this engage this question of, you know, the master's tools and whether they can be used to dismantle the master's house? And I'm talking specifically about the fact that these archives exist and can be used to engage power by subsequent NGOs or social groups, like in the way there are current groups doing research around, say, the Dulcie September murders and Henny van Veeren's book, Apartheid, Guns and Money. But also if we look at the Marikana Commission, how in these cases, they very much are drawn out of this public call for truth and a public call for a truth commission. And this is the irony, right? Because at the transition, both the National Party and ANC didn't want a truth commission. They didn't want the truth to be out. And in fact, the post-amble to the Constitution just said nothing about truth, but all that it said was that there shall be amnesty in terms of crimes of the past. So yeah, I'd just like you to speak a bit much to perhaps the potentials that the commissions provide then in terms of the information that is accessible to the public to then use for subsequent accountability or civil suits and the like.
Yeah, no, thank you. My sense is we have to robustly and jealously fight for that archive. Kulumani's archive is incredibly rich and important. It could be reduced to ashes very quickly. The archive generated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, again, I don't want to suggest, I don't want to diminish the value of that archive at all. But its value hinges on what we're doing with it now. Marikana, for instance, it has that archive that has been generated by the commission, but also around the commission. In the public domain, through the media, there's a massive Marikana archive. It has a certain value as historical evidence. But arguably, its most important value has to do with what we're doing with it now in order to secure justice. And that's where I'm trying to push my finger into the bruise, is what is the work that that archive is doing now for the families of those who died at Marikana? Unless we keep pushing and mobilizing and using that archive as a resource for this continuing striving for justice, it will become inert in relation to the struggles of the people concerned, right?
Mm.
I'll stop there.
Thank you.
All right. We have Michelle Anderson.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks, Verne, for your presentation and that food for thought. It's also very much related to my work. I received my PhD from University of Cape Town for research on the mediation and mediatization of perpetrators or conflict actors in the special report broadcast and the resulting archive. So you've slightly touched on this, but just given your closing statements and this, I mean, essentially tradition that's been fostered of using archives as a tool to avoid transformation or truly engaging in justice, what do you think needs to happen in South Africa's political landscape and in archival practice to serve the aims of decolonization and to sort of move these critiques and recommendations that you've highlighted forward? I guess my questions are around like whose responsibility do you think that is, and what do you think that could look like in practice? Thank you.
So that's an impossible question, right? Almost in principle. I mean, what I am personally exploring, what my organization is exploring, and what many activists in South Africa that I have worked with or am working with now are exploring is the possibilities of transformation in the context of a resilient, almost immovable colonialism. The social contract that underpins democracy is failing, not only in South Africa. I think we can say globally that democracy is failing communities, failing societies. It's hard to think beyond democracy. But I think humanity has to be doing that. The particular line of inquiry that we're pursuing at the Nelson Mandela Foundation has to do with social bonding praxis, as we're calling it. What do you do when the state is failing? Do you give up on the state? What do you do when revolution is not an option for you? And so we have in a number of areas, early childhood development, and now in food security, are exploring the possibilities of how you work with elements within the state, elements even within the private sector, and of course civil society, communities. How does one, from below, as it were, begin to transform social relations? How does one begin to redistribute social capital through networks that you are developing, through collaborations that have been tried before, collaborations that we are only beginning to imagine now? There's no quick fix, you can tell. This is almost what I would call a fungal strategy. Personally, I'm not seeing alternatives to that right now. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for one last question here. We have one in the chat from Celine Kazan, and I'll just read it out here for you. In your book, Archival Silver, you argued that archives are never a reflection of reality because when a document finally arrives in an archive, it has already passed through the hands that created it, the hands that managed it, the archivists who gathered it, and the researchers who read it. Also, given the fact that some records are not even accessible or are destroyed, how can one ensure that the TRCs and archives even reach their primary goal of establishing factual truth?
Yeah, no, thank you. I would argue that the primary goal is not establishing factual truth. The primary goal is the liberation of a society, the liberation of communities, of families. That's the primary goal. Establishing the facts obviously is an element of that. But for me, it's about the work of justice. I'll stop there, thanks.
Excellent. I think that's a really great point to end on here. Lots to think about with that one. So I just want to very quickly thank everyone who posed those insightful questions and shared your thoughts on the talk as well. And of course, thank you to Verne Harris as well for that presentation and for kicking off the conference, giving us lots to think about over these next 2 days. Maybe we will come up with some of these solutions very optimistically over the next few days for how to move forward. Just a quick reminder, tomorrow, October 25th, we do have our day 2 keynote speakers, Selena Flores and Veronica Torres, with their talk about historical cultural heritage and guarantor of rights in transitional contexts. So those remarks will begin at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard tomorrow morning, and just use the same link to join on here. For anyone that is registered for the remainder of the conference and for those presenting on this afternoon's panels, we will break very briefly now until about 11:15 Eastern Standard, so just over 15 minutes, and then we will resume conference activities. And just a reminder, to access the remainder of the panels, you do use the same Zoom where we will keep it open, so you're welcome to keep it open on your end. And just a final thank you again to everyone for attending and for really engaging in this keynote address with Verne Harris. Have a lovely rest of your day. And for those conference participants, again, we will see you shortly in about 15 minutes. Thank you.